Whether its value can actually be measured by any number of words, photography is a powerful language that is anything but universal and used by more than just photographers. Bayeté Ross is an artist who uses the language of photography and sculpture and video and music and whatever else he can use to raise questions about how we think about ourselves and others, engaging assumptions that influence our perceptions and actions in a culture that is surrounded by stereotype. Around this time last year, he was named a presidential leadership scholar, one of just 60 people selected for their leadership in improving civic engagement and social good in their community, country, or the world. Please welcome Bayeté Ross Smith.
Thank you very much for that excellent introduction, Vince. You make me sound really good. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's great to see all of you. So my name is Bayeté Ross Smith, and I would describe myself as an interdisciplinary artist and storyteller. But a critical element of my work is telling stories in ways that are accessible and relevant to daily life and daily lived experiences of my audiences, and discussing these stories in ways that are innovative and profound given people's daily lived experience. This image here is an image from one of my first photographic series that was successful. It's a project called Our Kind of People. And what I was interested in this project was examining how clothing, ethnicity, skin tone, race, and fashion combined with gender impact our perceptions of other people. So I'm very interested as an artist in the concept of identity, particularly the idea that identity is not just a set of criteria, but it's also a performance. Furthermore, I believe that identity, ideas of beauty, value, and reciprocity inform our human interactions on the most fundamental level, whether it's interpersonal or whether it's on a macro level, meaning one community to the other. So with Our Kind of People, what I was really curious about is telling a story about identity and raising questions about identity, but doing it in a way that relates to everyone's lived experience and makes it personal. So I'm not telling people what to think, and I'm not creating a specific narrative with this body of work. What I'm doing is allowing there to be a moment for each individual viewer to take a look at these images and reflect upon their perceptions of each one of these characters and the impact that has on them. Now, all the characters in this series are real people. They're not models. And these are all articles of clothing that they own, and it's worn in a style in which they would wear them on a daily basis. I didn't style them in any way that would be abnormal. So ultimately, you could find any one of these people looking like any one of these alter egos on any given day. So again, the question becomes, when I see these images and I see these different versions of these people, as a viewer, what about my personal background is projected upon each of these images? So this leads me to another key point about my work, and something that I attempt to do, and I think all of us should attempt to do and be more thoughtful about. And that is to be experimental, to take risks, and not allow ourselves to be limited by outdated models for nonfiction storytelling. We're fortunate to be making images in a time where we have a lot of access to information and resources. And it's also very important, in my opinion, to work collaboratively within communities and share the power and agency in the storytelling. So gone are the days where we're telling other people's stories for them. We're telling other people's stories with them. And it's important for us to share that power and that control. I also think it's very significant to be able to tell stories and examine subject matter without being too specific about what our audience should think. In this day and age, we have too much access to information for that. People don't want you telling them what to think, at least not in my opinion. I mean, I don't need people telling me what to think. I'm relatively intelligent. So when we tell stories with our images, I think it's critically important to provide a framework for examining a topic and examining a subject matter and giving people the freedom to reflect on their perceptions and therefore ask themselves more questions, as opposed to something that's a one-liner that shuts down ideas related to that subject matter. This is another example. This is a project I did called Taking Aim. And what I was curious about with this project was looking at the structural mechanisms of violence and thinking about the idea of who is considered a threat and who is considered a victim. And how do those perceptions impact someone's likelihood of being involved in interpersonal violence on any level. So obviously I'm making these targets. And the inspiration for this stemmed from an actual visit I had to a firing range years ago. And I actually shoot from time to time. Not a whole lot, but it's something that's fun to do that I like to do maybe once a year or so. And I noticed that at the firing range, none of the targets looked like actual people you might encounter on a daily basis. They all looked like caricatures from a cops and robbers scenario. And the reality in relation to violence, particularly gun violence in North America, is that if you're involved in that type of scenario, you're probably going to be shooting someone that looks like one of your neighbors. You probably won't be the hero who stops a mass shooting, and you probably are not going to stop Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any other terrorist. I mean, you might, but that's unlikely, right? And so it was really curious to me that none of the targets at the firing range looked like actual people you encounter on a regular basis. Now, again, I'm not telling people what to think or how to analyze the structural mechanisms of violence. I'm providing a platform of self-reflection and conversation that you can have with other people. I made this particular piece after Tamir Rice was killed because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's actually a rocket scientist who lives in Cleveland. I like to slide that in there, that I'm friends with a rocket scientist. And I like to slide in that he attended a historically black college with me. But we were talking about at what age do young black men become considered adults and then perceived as threats. And so when Tamir Rice was killed, we were like, oh, we have our answer. It's 12. So again, utilizing these targets to create a scenario where people can ask questions of themselves, of other people, and engage in conversation and discussion. Now, another thing I did with these targets was I actually took them to the firing range and shot them. And I also encouraged other people at the firing range to shoot my targets with me. And I even brought some of the people who were in the targets to the range to shoot them with me as well, which was an interesting process. So when I mention engaging with audiences and people in daily life and a daily lived experience, that also often means activating my work beyond being art objects and having them live and have a life in the world. So again, you know, a lot of my work examines identity and how that impacts fundamental human interactions. This is an image from a series that I did called Passing. And what I did here was I took photographic replications of passports from around the world and put the same faces and photographs on all these different passports. Here I'm curious about not only how will we perceive the same person based on nationality, but also how do we perceive a certain nationality based on race and ethnicity as well as gender. Also, I think this work is interesting because it creates a scenario where we think about the relationships of different countries, the way they're paired with one another, and what are our associations with different countries. Now again, you know, going back to this idea of identity, we make a lot of assumptions about identity when we encounter people, and there's a lot of stereotypes and preconceived notions when we interact with one another. Now the challenge there, when we consider identity as a performance, is that all of us are projecting a certain thing about our identity that we want to communicate with other people, but that message is not always accurately received. But when people are communicating who they are to us, there are certain things that they are expecting us to assume based on how they represent themselves, right? So when we think about nationality, for example, there are things that can be safe to assume about someone based on a nationality. Then there are things that are stereotypes. And a lot of the time, it's about navigating those lines in between all of those. So for example, if I meet someone and I know they're from Cuba, it's a reasonable assumption to assume that they grew up speaking Spanish and that it's probably their first language, right? That's a reasonable assumption. It's not a reasonable assumption to assume they're a good salsa dancer. So what we're constantly doing, in my opinion, is navigating that line between a reasonable assumption based on identity and what people communicate to us and a stereotype. And that's where we navigate and get into the nuances of how to relate to one another more effectively in a more compelling and compassionate way. I'm very interested in not limiting myself to a specific medium. So I'm trained as a photographer. However, I work in multiple mediums, including video, installation, sculpture. And I think it's really important to figure out the to figure out the concept for a body of work, and then clarify what the best medium is for that, and then the various platforms for that. And I'm very interested in doing multi-platform storytelling as well. So thinking about how can the same artistic content be distributed effectively in a gallery installation or a museum, as well as on desktop, on mobile, printed in a book, in events, in public spaces, as well as private spaces. I'm also very interested in thinking about how we can utilize new technology to tell stories in more innovative ways. Now, this next piece relates to this concept of using identity portraiture, but flipping the idea of nonfiction through using performers. So I'm going to show you this piece, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about it. It's a time-based piece that is a real story that happened, but I decided to experiment with making multiple storytellers tell the same story, and then question how the identity of the storyteller impacts our perception of that story. Oh, you know what? Actually, yeah, so that will come up in a moment.
I was maybe 21. I was at the West 4th Street Park watching a basketball game, and I had my little radio with me playing some music, not loud, and a cop was on the phone. And he told me to turn my music down, and I did.
And then when he got off the phone, he comes and he asks me for my ID. And I asked him, what's the problem? And he tells me that he gave me an order and I didn't follow it.
I said, order. I was like, you asked me if I could turn down my music, and I did. You didn't ask me if I could turn it off. And he continued to press me for ID. And I asked him, what's the charge? What's the issue?
So he said, so I gave him my college ID and my ATM card, and he said, you're under arrest for disorderly conduct. And then, as the crowd began to gather,
they just wanted to know what was going on, like why was I being arrested? And then he tells everyone back up before he starts to arrest everyone. Particularly this white woman that was trying to intervene.
She said he told her that if she didn't back up, he would arrest her for obstruction of justice. So I got detained.
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 So I was detained.
So that particular piece, I took a story that was a real account of what happened and had actors of different backgrounds recite that story as a monologue. And the way this works is this is a digital project that you can engage with online. I've published it on my website, but I am curious about publishing it or working with a media production organization to distribute it. But currently it's on my website. And the audience can decide when to change which storyteller is speaking. And when you change which storyteller is speaking, the story, as you see, picks up in the same place. Now, I also mentioned experimenting with new technology. So I'm very interested in what can be accomplished with virtual reality, augmented reality, and 360 virtual reality. The next piece I'm going to show you is a piece that I did that's part of an ongoing series where I'm looking at historic sites where an important event happened, and then filming the contemporary historic site in 360 VR, and then weaving in archival images that are historic that relate to the event that happened there. And what I'm really interested in is how we live on top of history every day that is often unresolved, and therefore, because it's unresolved, we often end up repeating a lot of the issues that are connected with those events. This particular one is about the assassination of Malcolm X.
It was a cold but very sunny day, and we were having a rally at the Audubon Ballroom. 2 weeks prior to that, he had been banned from France when he tried to go to speak in Paris. The next weekend, his home was firebombed. But I always remember him saying, "The way I feel today, I should not even be here." We said to him, "Then why don't you go home where everybody can understand all the pressure you've been under?" And he said, "No, I really have to speak today." I heard Brother Malcolm say, "Assalamu alaikum," and next thing I heard were the shots. I ran all the way down the Audubon and jumped up on the stage. His shirt was open. I saw all these holes in his body, and he was gasping. And I remember thinking to myself, he's going to die, he's going to die, he's going to die. These brothers came up, had a roller stretcher, because not one doctor would come over to the Audubon. They were right across the street, and they had to literally bogart a stretcher, and they rolled it back over to the hospital. It was announced that he had died. I stayed up all night. I was just sitting there. I was half crying. I was angry. The next day, I sat down and I wrote. I wrote about God. Brother Malcolm had the ability to inspire people, to make them transcend their own narrow interests and think of a larger entity. I think the human rights movement was derailed by the assassinations of Brother Malcolm and Dr. King.
So what you just saw was a screenshot, essentially, of how that functions on desktop. But again, you can experience that on mobile. It's most ideal in a headset. But in addition to that, it can also be installed as an installation with projections. So again, I think a lot about how my work can be installed and engaged with in multiple ways, and how it then, therefore, can be accessible to the broadest range of people. This image you're seeing here is a still image from another piece I did about Ruby Bridges when she helped desegregate the New Orleans school system in 1960. Both this piece and the Malcolm X piece can be seen upstairs on the second floor in a series of VR headsets that we have set up for viewing. So when you have a moment, I encourage you to check those out and experience them in their fullest, most dynamic way. So again, I want to encourage us all to be bold, be thoughtful, take risks, experiment, and be mindful of engaging audiences where they are within the course of their daily lives so we can have maximum impact. I really appreciate you spending your morning with us, and thank you very much for listening to me talk.